The following Appalachian Mountains horror story is real, disturbing, and should be used as a warning. The names and locations have been altered to protect the individuals involved. Viewer discretion is advised. A few summers ago, a battle-hardened Army Ranger was alone in the North Georgia mountains when something disturbing found him in the dark. Something that didn't run, something that watched, and to this day, he has never told a soul, until now. Staff Sergeant Braxton finally told this story. Not to his chain of command, not to his buddies at the team room, not to his wife. He told it the way men like him tell things they can't explain, quietly once, like setting down something heavy he'd been carrying too long. He said he needed to get it off his chest. He said if he told anyone who knew him, anyone who'd watched him run a ranger lane, anyone who'd seen him chew out a student at 0200 in the pouring rain, they'd never look at him the same way again. So he kept it. For a few summers, and then he didn't. Here's what you need to understand about Staff Sergeant Braxton before we go any further. 8 years in the Army, 2 combat deployments, Ranger Tab, Sapper Tab. He is one of the Ranger instructors at the 5th Ranger Training Battalion, Camp Frank D. Merrill, Dahlonega, Georgia, right in the heart of the North Georgia mountains. And his job, reduced to its ugly truth, is this: find the absolute limit of a young soldier's mind and then push past it. Professionally, repeatedly, without apology. This is day 15 of the mountain phase. If you've never heard of Ranger School, here's what you need to know. It's a 62-day course, 3 phases. By the time a student hits day 15 of mountain phase, he has already survived lower mountaineering. A 200-foot night rappel off Mount Yonah in the dark. 10 straight days of combat patrols on roughly 2 hours of sleep per night. These guys are hollow-eyed and mud-caked and running on nothing but stubbornness and the collective shame of not wanting to quit in front of each other. They are, technically, still functional human beings, but only barely. Braxton had watched hundreds of them cycle through. Some quit, some graduated. All of them left changed. The Ranger instructors stayed, permanent fixtures of this particular brand of suffering, like the mountain laurel, and the mud, and the cold that crept into your boots before midnight. Earlier that evening, around last light, Braxton was standing at the patrol base rally point watching a student, some kid from the 82nd Airborne, couldn't have been 23 years old, attempt to brief his patrol order. The kid had the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had recently made peace with death. Then he called the Etowah River, the Etowah Creek. Braxton didn't blink. He just let the silence sit there like a stone on a table until the kid corrected himself. Sergeant First Class Dodd, a thick Georgian with a jaw like a cinder block, standing just off Braxton's shoulder, leaned over and muttered, "You think he even knows where he is right now?" Braxton said, "He knows he's somewhere bad. That's enough." Dodd snorted. They'd had that conversation, in different variations, about 400 times. Before pushing out for his solo movement, Braxton checked his night vision monocular, topped off his water, and told Dodd he'd be at Patrol Base Charlie by 0400. Dodd didn't look up from his notebook. "Don't get eaten by a bear." Braxton didn't answer. He'd been moving these lanes for 3 years. He knew every draw, every ridge spur, every laurel hell between the Garrett's farm drop zone and the Etowah River drainage. He knew where the ground got soft near the creek banks. He knew which slopes would hold frost in October and which ones drained fast. These woods were his office. He'd furnished every corner of it. He flipped down his night vision and the world went green. He stepped past the tree line. The mountain laurel closed in on both sides, thick and dark, the branches locking together overhead like fingers interlacing. He registered a thought he'd had 100 times before and never once examined. Alone is fine. Alone means nothing can surprise you. He pushed further in. The laurel swallowed the last of the ambient light from the patrol base. Behind him, the voices of students faded to nothing. The mountain laurel closed behind him like a mouth. He didn't notice it then. He would later. The Etowah River drainage at 0300 hours is never truly quiet. Crickets, tree frogs, the low churn of creek water rolling over limestone, the occasional crack of a sleep-deprived student bumbling off his azimuth somewhere in the dark. If you've never been in deep woods at night, that ambient noise is actually a comfort. It's the forest's way of telling you that nothing seriously wrong is happening. Everything is breathing. Everything is moving. The world is working the way it's supposed to. Staff Sergeant Braxton had spent 3 years learning to read that sound the way a sailor reads water. Not consciously, just a constant background register of normal humming along underneath everything he did. He was 40 minutes into his movement, picking his way down a steep draw, boots finding the rocks automatically, night vision painting everything in flat green light, when the register went flat. Not quiet, silent. The frogs stopped first, then the insects. The creek still ran. Water doesn't scare. But everything that breathed and moved in those woods simply stopped, all at once, like someone had pulled a plug. Braxton stopped with it, thumb resting on his radio. His eyes swept the tree line in slow arcs. A predator moving through the drainage would explain it. A black bear pushing through the hollow, shoving the noise cone ahead of it. That was standard. That happened. He'd seen it a dozen times on these lanes. He waited 90 seconds, counting in his head, eyes moving. Nothing broke the tree line. Nothing moved in the green world of his night vision. No shape, no shimmer, no eye shine. He filed it under bear and pushed on. Because that's what professionals do. They don't let the woods spook them. There was a patrol base that needed checking, and a student patrol leader who had already demonstrated a troubling inability to read a grid coordinate, and none of that was going to fix itself. He kept moving. The boot prints stopped him cold. He almost walked past them. The creek bank here was a narrow strip of soft mud wedged between the water and a wall of rhododendron, and he was focused on his footing. But his night vision caught the impressions at the last second, and his body stopped before his brain fully processed why. He crouched down. Military tread, the unmistakable lug pattern of a standard-issue Belleville boot, the same boot every Ranger student in that forest was wearing, the right size for a young soldier. The stride length was purposeful, not stumbling. Whoever made these prints had been moving with direction, moving like they knew where they were going. Braxton followed the track line with his eyes from the tree line all the way down to the water's edge, where they ended. Mid-stride. No hesitation, no scramble, no sign of a fall or a stumble or a sudden change of direction. The prints simply terminated at the waterline, like whoever made them had been lifted cleanly off the earth between one step and the next. No return track running parallel, no disturbance in the creek itself. The damp soil on the far bank was completely undisturbed, smooth and dark and untouched. Braxton stayed in his crouch for a long moment. His brain cycled through explanations the way it always did. Student crossed here. The current washed out the entry point. The exit track was just out of his sight line. He ran each one, and none of them closed cleanly. None of them locked. He pulled out his notebook and marked the grid coordinate. Then he stood up and kept moving. Because that's what you do. 100 meters further down the draw, the vibration came up through his boot soles before any sound reached his ears. A rhythmic, heavy thud. Quadrupedal, deliberate. Not the chaotic stumbling of a student who'd wandered off his azimuth. Not the rolling, shambling gait of a black bear moving through brush. This was something with intention behind its movement, and enough mass to telegraph itself up through damp Georgia soil before it was anywhere close enough to hear directly. Braxton's hand went to his rifle by pure reflex. Grip, safety, finger outside the trigger guard. But then he remembered. Blank adapters, training environment. His rifle was loaded with blanks, had been all week. A blank round will make noise and flash and absolutely nothing else. Against something with that kind of mass behind its footfall, it was slightly more useful than harsh language. The thudding stopped. Whatever made it had stopped moving. And in the sudden stillness, pressing in from every direction at once, the only question that mattered was simple and terrible and had no good answer. Where? Braxton went to a knee, not a panic drop, a controlled, deliberate movement. The same thing he'd done 100 times in training, a dozen times for real, downrange in places that don't make the news. One knee in the mud, rifle up, breathing locked into the 4-count rhythm they drilled into him so deep it fired on its own now. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. His night vision swept the tree line in slow, methodical arcs. Fog, shadow. The skeletal fingers of laurel branches reaching into the green phosphor world like something grasping. The creek murmured behind him. Nothing moved. He held, kept sweeping. Then the shape bloomed. White. Not the dull gray white of a deer's rump catching light. Not the smeared, diffuse white of ground fog rolling through the understory. White. Bright and wrong and impossible to look away from. Here's something most people don't know about night vision. White objects don't just appear white in the green phosphor world. They bloom. They overexpose. They bleed light outward from their edges like they're generating it from the inside. In a forest full of dark greens and blacks and grays, a white object in night vision doesn't just stand out. It pulses. This shape pulsed. Low to the ground but massive across its width, moving on all fours at the far edge of the tree line, just inside the shadow line where the laurel thickets grew thickest. Braxton's brain went immediately to bear, because that's the only thing in these mountains that size moves on 4 legs. But a bear moves with a rolling, shambling weight. You can feel the effort in it, the mass negotiating with gravity, stride by stride. This thing moved the way water moves. No wasted effort, no telegraphing, just continuous fluid displacement from one point to the next, like the space between those 2 points had simply ceased to exist. It crossed a 15-foot gap between 2 laurel thickets in a single bound and made absolutely no sound on landing. Not a branch, not a footfall, not a single leaf disturbed. 15 feet of open ground, and it arrived on the other side in total silence, like the earth itself had agreed not to acknowledge it. Braxton's lungs locked. Every combat reflex he owned fired at the same moment. He was not afraid, not yet, not the way fear actually feels when it finally arrives. He was assessing. Unknown entity, unknown behavior, unknown threat level. That was the box he put it in, because the box was familiar, and the box had walls, and right now walls were useful. He keyed his radio to report back to Sergeant First Class Dodd. Static. A dead, flat hiss that meant exactly one thing: dead ground. He was at the bottom of the draw, limestone walls rising on 2 sides, the ridge mass above him eating every signal in every direction. No comms. In a training environment, dead ground was an inconvenience. You marked it, you moved, you found high ground and tried again. Right now it meant something simpler and worse. Nobody knew where he was. Nobody could hear him. He had blank rounds in his rifle, a red lens flashlight, a knife, and his hands, and something the size of a large bear that moved like it had no weight at all, was 40 meters away in the tree line. He looked back through the night vision. The white shape had stopped moving. It was oriented toward him, not scanning, not startled, not doing the head bob a bear does when it's trying to pull your scent out of moving air. The bloomed white mass in his optic was still, the specific loaded stillness of a predator that has already finished its calculation and is simply waiting for the moment it has already chosen. There was a patience to it that was worse than movement. Movement he could track. Movement he could respond to. This was something deciding. Then it took one step in his direction. Slow, deliberate. The way you walk toward something when you have all the time in the world and you want it to know that. Braxton's thumb found his rifle's selector switch by muscle memory and moved it, and then stopped, because it didn't matter, because blanks, because none of his training had a box for this particular problem, and the box was starting to feel very small. One amber light blinked in the corner of his night vision monocular. Low battery warning. He had no spare. He'd run these lanes for 3 years and never once needed a spare because he'd never once let his battery run this low, and he had no idea how long that amber light had been blinking because he hadn't been looking at it. He'd been looking at the white shape. And now the white shape had taken one step toward him, and his only set of eyes in this darkness was telling him it was almost done. He pressed his back against the limestone face behind him. He went completely, utterly still. And he waited to find out if stillness was enough. The night vision died. No flicker, no warning fade. One blink and the green phosphor world was just gone, replaced by absolute total black. The kind of dark that has weight to it. The kind of dark that presses back when you open your eyes wider, like it's letting you know that trying harder won't help you here. Braxton didn't move. The fog had thickened while he'd been focused on the shape in the tree line, the North Georgia pea soup that rolls in off the ridges on still nights and reduces visibility to nothing. He couldn't see the creek, couldn't see the laurel, couldn't see the limestone face his shoulders were pressed against even though he could feel its cold through his kit. He held his hand up in front of his face and saw nothing. Not a shadow. Not an outline. Nothing. He controlled his breathing. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. He pressed himself flat against the rock and ran through what he knew. He knew the limestone was behind him, solid, unbroken, nothing coming from that direction. He knew the creek was to his left, maybe 8 feet, and the far bank was undisturbed mud that would slow anything crossing it. He knew the draw-channeled movement. Anything coming toward him was coming from in front or from his right, through the laurel. In Ranger School, they teach you that movement gets you killed in the dark. The eye catches motion, not mass. A still object in darkness is invisible. He was a rock. He was part of the mountain. He was furniture. He locked every muscle in his body and became the limestone. But then the wet, rhythmic breathing started. Not far. 10 feet. Maybe less. He couldn't tell, and that was the worst part. The dark had eaten his spatial awareness completely, and the breathing was just there, arriving from the black in front of him with no sense of distance, no sense of direction, filling the narrow draw the way water fills a low place. It was slow, measured. A low rolling exhalation, not panicked, not excited, not the quick hot panting of an animal that had been running. This was the breathing of something that had arrived exactly where it intended to arrive and was in absolutely no hurry about what came next. There was a rhythm to it that was almost patient, almost thoughtful. The damp soil under Braxton's boot soles began to pulse, that same quadrupedal thud from earlier, but slower now, deliberate. a weight shifting from one enormous foot to the next in a wide, circular pattern. It was moving around him, not charging, not retreating, circling. The way you walk a perimeter when you're checking the edges of something, when you're making sure of something. Braxton's jaw locked so hard his back teeth ached. The fog moved against his left cheek. Not wind. There was no wind in the draw, hadn't been all night. This was displacement, the movement of air being pushed aside by something large passing close. Very close. The breathing was directly in front of him now, close enough that he could feel the faint warmth of it against the cold night air, and his brain tried to assign it a distance and kept arriving at a number that couldn't be right. His heart hammered against his sternum so hard, he was genuinely certain it was audible. A flat, meaty percussion against bone, over and over, loud as a boot on wet ground. He was sure it could hear it. He was sure everything within 100 meters could hear it. His lungs had reduced themselves to the thinnest possible sips of air. Barely enough to keep the 4 count going, barely enough to keep the darkness from folding inward. The taste of copper sat at the back of his throat. Then something touched his left shoulder. The lightest possible contact. A brush of pressure through the fabric of his kit, there and gone in less than a second. The way you'd test the temperature of a stove with one finger before committing your hand. Exploratory, deliberate, not accidental. Braxton did not move. He did not breathe. He stood against that limestone with his useless rifle locked in both hands, and he counted seconds in his head, because it was the only thing left to do. The only structure left in a situation that had shed every other familiar shape. 1, 2, 3. The breathing was still there. The weight was still shifting in the mud. 8, 9, 10. The fog moved against his face again. Another slow pass. Another displacement. Something large completing its circle. 17, 18. 19. He counted. He had no other choice. The breathing stopped. Just like that. Between one exhale and the next. Gone. The vibration in the soil faded with it, the slow quadrupedal weight lifting away increment by increment, until the ground under his boots was just ground again. Still damp, ordinary. The draw stayed silent for a long time. Then, from somewhere high above him on the ridge, a single tree frog started up. One small voice in all that dark. Then another answered it from further up the slope. Then the crickets came back, not all at once, but in a slow rolling wave, like a crowd returning to their seats after an intermission, filing back in from the edges, filling the silence back up from the outside in. Whatever had been in that draw with him was gone. Braxton stood with his back against the limestone and did not move for 22 minutes. Not because he was paralyzed. Not because his legs wouldn't work. He stood there because he was doing math. Cycling through every animal in the North Georgia mountains. Every training aid, every piece of equipment, every Ranger student who could have wandered off azimuth into this drainage. He ran the numbers the same way he ran them downrange when a situation refused to make sense. Methodically, without ego, starting from the beginning each time. Bear, student, equipment malfunction, atmospheric distortion. He built each explanation carefully, and each one collapsed before he could finish it. No solution found. The eastern ridge began to gray with the first pale suggestion of pre-dawn light. Braxton looked down. 6 inches from where his left boot had been planted for 22 minutes, pressed deep into the soft mud of the draw floor. A single handprint. 5 fingers. No claws. Roughly human in its basic geometry. The spacing of the fingers. The suggestion of a palm. The way the weight had distributed from heel to tip. But the palm was the size of a dinner plate. The fingers had pressed so deep into the soft mud that the edges had curled slightly, the way mud curls when something very heavy settles into it very slowly, like it had been standing there for a while. Braxton stared at it for a long time. Then he took a knee, pulled out his notebook, and sketched it. Exact dimensions, depth, finger spacing, the measured, precise documentation of a man who encounters something he cannot yet explain and refuses to pretend otherwise. His hand was steady. He noted that detail himself later. His hand was completely steady. He closed the notebook. He stood up. He had a patrol base to check. Braxton reached Patrol Base Charlie at 0537. The student patrol leader, same kid from the 82nd Airborne with the 1,000-yard stare, was waiting at the perimeter. The kid had spent the night being quietly terrified and was now performing calm for his squad the way exhausted young soldiers do. Jaw set, eyes forward, every muscle in his face working hard to project a confidence his body wasn't feeling. Braxton had seen that look 10,000 times. He'd worn it himself once, a long time ago. He ran the debrief flat and professional. Noise discipline, security posture. The kid had called the wrong grid during his salute report, a standardized enemy contact format, and Braxton corrected him in the same tone he used for everything. Even, unhurried. Iron. The students on that patrol base watched their ranger instructor move through the debrief and saw exactly what they always saw: a fixed point, an unmovable thing, the kind of man the mountain didn't touch. Nobody looked at him differently. Nobody knew. Back at the ranger instructor tent at 700, Sergeant First Class Dodd handed him a cup of coffee without looking up from his lane assessment forms. "See any bears?" Braxton said, "No." He drank the coffee. He pulled out his own assessment forms and began filling them out in the same steady block print he always used. Student performance, patrol base security, leadership decisions. He wrote it all down in the careful, precise language of a man who has been trained to document what he observes and nothing else. He did not write about the silence in the drainage. He did not write about the boot prints that ended mid-stride at the waterline. He did not write about 22 minutes against a limestone face in total darkness, with something breathing 10 feet away from him in the fog. He capped his pen, stacked his forms, went to his cot at 800. He lay awake until 9:30, staring at the canvas ceiling, doing the same math he'd been doing since the draw, arriving at the same answer every single time. No solution found. A few weeks later, a newer ranger instructor, fresh to the battalion, hadn't even run a full cycle yet, cornered Braxton after physical training with the particular energy of a man who wants to ask something he isn't sure he should ask. He said the students on Patrol Base Delta kept reporting something moving the perimeter wire at night. Big, walking on all fours. One kid said it was white, but nobody believed the kid because the kid hadn't slept in 6 days, and sleep deprivation does things to a person's eyes that are difficult to explain and easy to dismiss. The new instructor asked Braxton what he thought it was. Braxton told him it was probably a bear. He used the same flat, unhurried iron tone he used for everything. The new instructor nodded, satisfied, and walked away with his answer tucked neatly under his arm like a thing resolved. Braxton watched him go. He didn't say anything else. Alone is fine. Alone means nothing can surprise you. He'd believed that once. He'd believed it the way you believe things that have always been true, without examining them, without needing to, because the evidence had never suggested otherwise. He'd spent 3 years furnishing every corner of those woods in his mind, every draw, every spur, every laurel hell between the drop zone and the river. He'd built a complete picture of that place and called it mastery, and moved through the dark with the quiet confidence of a man who knows his office. A few summers ago, something in a draw off the Etowah River drainage quietly, patiently, and without any particular urgency, rearranged all the furniture. Here is what I want you to sit with before you go. The Appalachian Mountains are the oldest mountains on Earth. They were here before the Cherokee named them, before the first European boot ever touched their soil, before anyone thought to build a school in their draws to teach young men how to survive hard places. They have been standing here, slowly, quietly wearing down, for roughly 480 million years, and they will be standing here long after the last patrol base is struck, and the last Ranger tab is sewn on, and the last Ranger instructor locks up the team room and drives home for the last time. That is a very long time to be a place. That is a very long time to be home to things. Staff Sergeant Braxton is a hard man by any reasonable measure, shaped by years of deliberate professional suffering into something genuinely close to unshakable. 2 deployments, a Ranger tab, a sapper tab. A career built on the simple premise that the dark is just a working environment and hard places are just offices and fear is just information to be processed and filed. He is not a man given to ghost stories. He needed a few summers before he could say it out loud, and even then he only said it once, and even then he kept his voice completely even, the same flat, unhurried iron tone he uses for everything. What he said was this: something in those mountains let him walk in, watched him work, and then let him walk out. He doesn't know why. He doesn't have a theory. He doesn't have a solution in his notebook to put next to the sketch of that handprint. He just knows that the oldest mountains in the world have had a very long time to be home to things we don't have names for yet, and that the dark doesn't need your permission to be inhabited. It never did. For more Appalachian Mountains horror stories, click here. I'm the Shadow Teller. Stay safe in the dark.